Hello again, this is Dr. Jessica Wright. Today we're going to be talking about grief etiquette. So there's a lot of us that are experiencing, a lot of change, a lot of turmoil, and unfortunately more and more of us know someone who has died from this virus, and or someone who is experiencing a different type of grief or loss in their life. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about what we know from the research that helps, what you can do from the outside, and a little bit of etiquette about what to do and what not to do. So, the question that comes up very often is exactly how does grief work? This has been a topic of study since World War II. After the concentration camps, there were a lot of people that were trying to understand the psychology of how does grief work. And one of the things that I found, a little bit lighthearted about this topic is we all want grief to work in a linear fashion. We want it to work from point A to point B so that it will be over. And in reality, there's a little graphic up here that says how grief actually works, is that it's complicated and we go back and forth and each of us experience it differently. That's going to be the heart of this presentation, is really that grief is experienced differently by everyone, and that is something that is important to keep in mind when you're talking to someone who is grieving. Part of why we want a system or a process to understand grief is because we are so desperate, we crave so badly simple or at least straightforward processes to know what the future is going to be like. And when we contemplate something like grief, where someone has lost a loved one, or where someone has experienced just a terrible event, we really want to be able to plan for the future. It makes us feel more secure if we know what's coming next. And that's part of why we expect, we're always looking for the next steps. So, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is actually a Swiss-American psychiatrist. She's from the university, she was a variety of places, but she did a lot of her research at the University of Chicago, and she's the author of a very famous book called On Death and Dying. And in her book, she describes the stages of grief as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, something you've probably heard before. Importantly, as we understand more and more about grief, one of the bigger findings is that these stages are not linear, and once you move through denial into anger, people often go back to denial before they move on to bargaining, and maybe they're in depression for a while before they go to acceptance, and then back to anger, or around and around and around again until the grief process is finished. And in fact, actually, that's what Dr. George Bonanno, the clinical psychologist at Columbia, found was that bereavement tracks, he found that people will go through these different processes, and that people work on things at different levels, and that their tracks sort of vary. He found that about 15% of people go through prolonged experiences of grief, where that acute stage of grief is no longer something that diminishes over time, but that they stay in a prolonged stage of grief. About 15% get onto what he referred to as a recovery track, where people are able to, they have an acute moment of pain, an acute time of grief, and then they move on towards something else, and they heal from it, they move on to something else. And then he refers to a track called resilience, which he said about 30% of people fall into this resilience track, where they have the acute pain, they're able to eventually, once they pass the acute pain that they are in, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of pain, they are then able to pick up their life and do the work that they need to do in their jobs and in their families, and yet they're still experiencing this acute grief. And so it's this idea of moving forward despite being in this acute grief, until they get to the point where they are able to be out of the grief entirely. So what do we know about all this? So we've got these different psychiatrists that are curious and they're trying to find out, how does grief work, and what's the big summary? The big story is everyone experiences loss differently, and that comparative suffering is not helpful. So if you've ever been through something terrible, perhaps you got into a car accident and you broke your leg, if someone comes into the hospital room and they say, I'm so sorry you broke your leg, but hey, at least you didn't break all of your bones in your body. Or, hey, one time I broke 2 legs, both my legs at the same time. Or, oh, but at least you're not as bad off as the person down the hall. There's a lot of really interesting psychology around why humans do that, but one of the important ideas to get behind this is that comparative suffering doesn't lessen the pain of the individual. It is helpful to have perspective of the whole world, but when you're in pain, you are in pain. And so if I say I'm in pain and your response is, yes, but the person over there is in more pain, it actually doesn't help me to move past my pain or move through my pain or accept my pain any better. So comparative suffering is one of those things that you're going to want to stay away from. And especially, any sort of advice that you might be giving the person about, how to move forward, it should be really tempered with this idea that when people are in pain, they're in pain, and you can't make it go away from the outside. You can't, and you also can't hurry them along in the process. So, hopefully you've seen this before. This is referred to in different places as ring theory or the circle diagram. So how do you help? Well, it depends on where you are in relation to the person directly affected. So maybe there is an inner group of people, maybe perhaps there is someone who has lost the father of a family has died. So the spouse, the close family members, the close friends around that person are going to be grieving as well. So the close family and friends, the spouse of that person is going to be grieving the most. That would be like I guess this is the purplish, brownish color in the middle, the people directly affected. And then those family members, the brothers and sisters, the aunts, the uncles, these family members on the outside are going to be affected as well, and they're really important to consider. And then there'll be the community and the neighbors, and then the wider community and other contexts. And the key with this whole idea of these circles or rings that go out from the person that's affected is that comfort should go inward, and any sort of venting, or they refer to it here as dump, right? Dumping, being able to pick up the phone and call and talk with someone about how much your grief is hurting you, that should go outward. So the person in the middle of the circle should be able to call people towards the outer rings of the circle. And let's say you're part of the close community, these neighbors. You shouldn't be calling on the family members or close friends in order to express what your grief is about the situation. Instead, you should be reaching out to wider community or other contacts that are not as impacted by this. And the same thing with close, family members and close friends shouldn't call the person directly affected by the event. But rather they should call other people that didn't know the individual as well, and the relationships aren't as close. And so importantly, so your venting or any of the processing that you need to do to move past grief or a terrible or hard situation should go out, and comfort should go in. So bringing food, we're going to talk a little bit about bringing food in a minute. All of those things should be going in. So family members and close friends should bring food to the person directly affected, and then neighbors and close community should bring food in that way. I want to acknowledge for a moment how culturally specific grief can be. And how, I think I was pretty clear on the previous slide about how each individual experiences grief differently, and then there are patterns of behavior around grief that are culturally related. And so being aware that you might be dealing with someone who grieves differently than you do, it's going to help you to have the empathy around that person, to give them the freedom to grieve however it is that they need to grieve. Okay, so what can you do to help? So, if you're talking with someone that has experienced a loss of some kind, acknowledge the pain. Acknowledge this is hard. This is hard. I was speaking with someone earlier today about how during the pandemic, there are different individuals that they have worked with for decades, and those individuals are retiring. And instead of there being a retirement party where everyone gets to go in and say goodbye, that the people are retiring, there's just an email sent out, there's some communication going around, but you don't get to have that sort of in-person, let me give you a hug, let me tell you how much of a pleasure it was to work with you for 30 years. That's missing. And so that's a form of grief. And we've talked in other sessions about different types of grief. It's not just when someone dies, but it can also be these other types of grief when you have a loss, right? And so if you're working from the outside in, trying to provide comfort, there are a few things that people that are in pain need to hear. And the first is acknowledging the pain. This is hard. This is hard. Not dismissing it, not trying to give it context. We all want to give it context. This is hard, but I'm sure it was meant to be. This is hard, but this is part of a whole plan. That can be helpful at another time, but when someone's in acute pain, all they need to hear is this is hard. All right, next, they want to know you're there. So they want to hear this is hard and I am here beside you. This is hard and I'm here beside you while you're experiencing this pain is the most comforting that you can do. And then asking, what is it that you need? Now, the person might say, I need space. I need to be alone, in which case responding appropriately would be to give them space. And they may also very commonly say, I don't know what I need. Don't pressure the person that's in pain to come up with what to do, what could be helpful. It's so hard, it's so uncomfortable to not have a way to help, a way to make the pain better, a way to be productive in this area. But here's the thing. Sometimes the best thing you can do from the outside is say, this is hard and I'm here. And food. I'm going to end by talking about food. So one of the ways that we can express to other humans just how much they mean to us and just how important they are and why we feel for them, we can express a lot of that through the language of food. Sending dishes, because right now with the virus it becomes logistically very tricky to cook and to bring food over. So if you can't bring the food directly over, having some sent. Food means a lot. Even if that person in the middle of their grief, they're not eating, and maybe there's a lot of food that gets thrown out because that individual's not eating. Other visitors that come to see them might be hungry. So if you've got, other family members that are coming over to help with grief, someone is going to get hungry, and having that there and having that not be something that you have to think about. If you're the person in grief, if you're the person in pain, knowing that you don't have to think about what food to put in your mouth, you don't have to think about what food to give any visitors or helpers that are there with you, makes the world of difference. And so I know that grief is a difficult topic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what has worked well for you. So I have this picture of food up there. That's really the question around my heart for our time this afternoon is, what is helpful to you when you are grieving? So often people say, I don't know what to say. So beyond this is hard and I'm here, what has been helpful to you in the past when you're grieving? If you feel like it, you can email us at academicrequests@houstonmethodist.org. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll be back soon with another Tools for Perseverance.